And welcome. I'm Michael Krasny, and we are talking today to the Commonwealth Club World Affairs Program with Jill Lepore. And let me just say, first of all, I'm the host of Krasny Conversations podcast and former host of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny and KQED Forum. And very pleased to be joined by Jill Lepore, author of a new book called We the People, A History of the U.S. Constitution. Let me tell you something about Jill Lepore. She is David Woods Kemper 41. That's the year he graduated, professor of American history at Harvard University and professor of law at Harvard's Law School. She's also a staff writer at The New Yorker, and her many books, I believe this is the 15th, maybe the 16th, we'll find out, under the the international bestseller, These Truths, A History of the United States. The Los Angeles Times this week called We the People a life buoy for a constitution under attack. And in it, Lepore argues that the U.S. Constitution was designed to provide a stable foundation for democracy, while also providing a nonviolent mechanism for change through amendment. But those amendments have been extremely rare, making it difficult for the government to adapt and solve new problems. And I must say, personally, I found this book exciting to read. Jill is a very good storyteller and also can give you a crash course in not only con law, but also American history. If you have questions for her, please share them through the YouTube chat. I'll be getting to them a bit later in the program. And welcome, Jill.
Thanks so much. It's delightful to be here.
Delighted to have you here. I guess let me start off by asking you about originalism. And I ask you about originalism because that, as you say, animates this book. And the big question that you raise early on, in fact, in your introduction, you say Madison, Jefferson, Hamilton, John Quincy Adams came to their view of constitutionalism, and how Robert Bork, Antonin Scalia, and Clarence Thomas came to a very different view in the late 20th century, which they nonetheless claim to belong to the late 18th century, is one of the stranger paradoxes of American constitutional history. Also one of the questions that animates this book. Indeed, originalism, how do we get there? How do we get to the point where we are now, where we think we can read the minds of our forefathers and study the Constitution in that spirit?
Well, let me just say at the outset that, I am not an originalist, and I disagree with originalist interpretations of the Constitution, but I think it's a good faith argument, and I think people who subscribe to originalism have good reasons to do so. I think it's a substantive disagreement. It's also a disciplinary disagreement, right? I'm a historian. Historians are not originalists methodologically. The method of originalism, the way that originalists think about the past, is quite different from the methods of my guild, academic history. But the book is interested maybe in a slightly different question, which is the history of originalism. As you say, how did we get to a place where originalism is the predominant method of judicial interpretation in our federal judiciary? I think it's important for Americans to think about how odd that is. We are the only country that does this particular thing, and most nations have written constitutions. So it's an unusual American form of judicial philosophy, and part of it is perfectly sensible, right? You have a very old document. You want to know what it means. You are going to read the document, and you're going to read the document quite carefully, right? Any student of history is going to begin there as well and think about the people that wrote the document and the conditions under which they wrote it, and the ideas, where they got their ideas, the books they read. Their lived experience in the world might be where historians go to next. But if for originalists, that the inquiry really ends there, right? So we have a very bounded historical record. If you're an originalist, you want to look at the Constitution, the notes kept by James Madison at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787, maybe the records of the ratifying conventions that met in the states, maybe the 85 essays that are now known as the Federalist Papers that argue for the ratification of the Constitution. And these are the places you look to understand the original meaning, intent, and public understanding of the Constitution, depending on the variety of originalism that you practice. But for historians, the historical record doesn't end there. We're, of course, interested in everyone else, not just the 55 people who are in that room, or not just the sizable number of men who participated in the ratifying conventions, but the meaning of that document, the circumstances under which it came to be written, in writ large across the whole of the people who are disenfranchised at the time, how that document has changed over time, how people's views of it have changed over time, what forces lay behind amendments that succeeded and those that failed. In other words, the point for me in writing the book is just kind of like the history of the Constitution is not the same as an originalist account of the Constitution. They're just totally different things. And what I wanted to offer is a historian's account of the history of the Constitution. So folded within that is the story of how originalism emerged.
Well, there are 55 men, as you said, emphasis on men, white men, men of property, men of holdings and considerable wealth in some cases. And that's where the Constitution, in terms of originalism, seems to fall down. Now, you gave a very nice concession to those who believe in originalism, but as a literary scholar, emeritus professor of literature, we have something called the intentional fallacy. How can you know, Beardsley and Wimsatt told us, what the intentions are of an author? And I certainly subscribe to that. How can we know the intentions of people who wrote something on a parchment, as you put it, that was made out of things that aren't even used anymore in terms of writing and keeping a record of something? So there seems to be a very strong argument against anti-originalism, and yet we live by it in terms of so much judicial review, don't we?
So we absolutely do. But I think there are several arguments you could make. One you have made is it's impossible to really reckon with the intentions of people who wrote a document a very long time ago. Another is, even if we could know, should we defer to those? And another would be, did they want us to defer to those? If we decide that one of their intentions, that their intentions need to be honored, we should be concerned about, did they intend for us to defer to them? And I think the answer basically to all those questions are no. But the law looks at these questions differently than a literary critic like you would, Michael, or than I would as a historian, because the law is interested in resolving disputes. So, if my grandfather wrote a will and it turned out upon his death that the will had some ambiguity to it, it is the obligation of the executor of his estate, who's dealing with that the series of bequests in that will, to try to determine what his intention was, right? That is a thing that law does, that is different than, well, what did Mark Twain mean when he wrote, X and such a phrase? So literary critics don't have the obligation to resolve disputes, right? Lawyers do. So that's partly what I mean by good faith. There are real questions about how to interpret an old document, and lawyers have rules and doctrines that they use to do so. I think originalism, though, exists in this country far outside the law. It is a kind of popular belief, a kind of folklore, right? That the founders were right about everything, and that, if you want to know, is it a violation of the Constitution for a city to pass a code that you can't bring a semi-automatic rifle to an elementary school? Somehow we're supposed to ask what James Madison would think about that. That, I would say, is quite different than the question of resolving the ambiguity in my grandfather's will, right? I don't think we defer to James Madison on that question. I think there is a body of experience, and there are other measures that we can use to try to understand whether such a municipal code is a good idea and is legal and constitutional.
It makes me think, though, almost in a reflexive way of, well, you write about some fascinating characters in this book, and I want to get into them, but someone like, I'm thinking about all of those fundamentalists, because that's often what they are, who are originalists, who believe that it's kind of a sacred document, and we have to see it as being completely inviolable, that the language somehow translates into our own language, despite how language has evolved and changed. And that's something that really is difficult for me to grapple with. It's even difficult to grapple with the whole idea of we the people. I mean, what a richly three words ambiguity that presents for us, because the people were not the same people who created the Constitution. They were not in their minds as the people that we think of now as the people, because of amendments and because of progress and change of generations.
Yeah, their understanding of the people was different than the way we use that word now, right? We think of the people, we might think of the electorate, we might think of the inhabitants of the residents of the United States, we might think of the citizenry, the native-born, naturalized American citizens as constituting the people. They had a narrower view of who the people were. The people were the propertied men who could participate in politics. People who were their commitment to what it was, in a sense, to be a person under the law was one that required economic independence. So married women were not persons under the law. They were subsumed under the personhood of their husbands. Women couldn't sign contracts or own property at the time, for instance. So women were not included in that. This was something that was kind of later the subject of a great deal of discussion. Could we just sort of by fiat say women are people, or do we need a constitutional amendment to establish the legal personhood of women under the Constitution? The 700,000 people held as slaves in the United States in the 1787 were not among the people, poor white men who didn't own enough property to vote, which is not a sizable portion of the population, but they were not subsumed among the people. It's a rhetorical device, and it's a meaningful one, and it is in relative to who among the population of nations all over the world in the 18th century have the capacity to participate publicly and politically and participate in the act of governing themselves. The proportion of the population that is among the people in the 18th century United States is huge compared to that in other countries. That is part of what is revolutionary about the American Revolution. By our standards, it's a very small portion of the population.
Well, how do we get to rely so much, though, on the Supreme Court for judicial hegemony or judicial supremacy, judicial review, replacing amendments? There was also the thought that you could do it by just having another convention to make an amendment. That method of revising the Constitution has never really been brought to bear, has it?
No, though it's been threatened often, and sometimes with great success at achieving the results that the threat hoped for. The method that the Constitution sets up for constitutional change is the formal amendment process in Article 5 of the Constitution, and
which, excuse me, has not been consummated since 1971. Am I correct?
It has been used. The 27th Amendment was ratified in 1992, but it is an amendment that was first proposed in 1789.
Yeah.
So in a sense, I don't really count it as a kind of new idea about the Constitution. But 1971 was the 26th Amendment ratified, and it lowered the voting age from 21 to 18.
Right.
Or in the context of the Vietnam War, where 18-year-olds were drafted but could not vote. So Article 5 is the formal method of constitutional amendment, and it turned out not to work as well or as easily as I believe was intended. And yet the Constitution needs to change it, and there are problems with it that need to be corrected. There are changing circumstances, population changes, changing ideas. So the Constitution has changed a great deal without Article 5 amendment as well as with it. But when Article 5 is not working well or is not available for one reason or another, the Constitution most often changes by way of Supreme Court and its interpretation of the Constitution. And that we're in an era right now because, as you say, the Constitution hasn't been meaningfully amended by Article 5 amendment since 1971. We're in an era where Supreme Court appointments are incredibly important, and there's just a great deal of contest over these nominations. If you think about, the Brett Kavanaugh or the Clarence Thomas or the Robert Bork, how much public interest there was in these confirmation hearings, which, were never even televised really before Bork, and were not even really held before the 1940s, right? The confirmation was sort of automatic. When the Constitution becomes more difficult to amend by Article 5 amendment, Supreme Court appointments take on a disproportionate power, which is one of the imbalances in our constitutional arrangement at the moment, but just one of them.
Well, you're involved in this amendments project. Could you say something about that? Because it's bringing a lot of things to bear, and you bring in your book a lot of importance of state constitutions and learning from amendments that didn't get through and failed.
Yeah, I just think it's worth considering what the history of popular constitutional agitation has been. And not because I think we should look at all the failed amendments. They all should have passed. They were great. Most of them are terrible. And like a lot of them are just terrible.
Hundreds.
A lot of them are wacky ideas. A lot of them are ideas that would be really destructive of equality. That a lot of them would reverse rights that have been gained, that are hard fought gains. But so there have been about 12,000 amendments to the U.S. Constitution formally introduced on the floor of Congress, and of course, many, 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 many more, bandied about in newspaper editorials or in magazine pieces or on social media. It comes and goes. There's not a lot of I think you probably can't think of is there any group right now that's fighting to amend the U.S. Constitution? There's really not, because it's not possible right now. It's effectively impossible, and people fight instead over the Supreme Court and its opinions. But
excuse me, but that's exactly what many of our founders, our originalists, didn't want to take place. They wanted a dynamic constitution that would change generation to generation. Jefferson certainly did, many of the others.
Jefferson certainly did, but they wanted, it's kind of like both and. They wanted a constitution to provide stability. They wanted it to last. That's one of the point. There are two reasons to write down a constitution, which was new at the time. It's something that had been practiced in the States, but it was new. One was England doesn't have a constitution. So when the colonists were frustrated at parliamentary taxation that they described as unconstitutional, they couldn't point to, Section 4, Paragraph 1. This is why, your Stamp Act is unconstitutional. This is why the Tea Act is unconstitutional. So they wanted to write down they had a lot of other reasons. They wanted to write down a constitution so that it would be transparent, so they could hold their rulers accountable to this frame of government. But they also wanted it to last. And that durability, though, is compromised if a constitution is too brittle, because everything changes. And everyone knew things were going to need to be changed. That's why they put in an amendment provision, so that they had just been through a terrible, horrible, violent war that lasted many years and caused great suffering. And they did not want to erect a new government in which the only way it would be possible to fundamentally change that government would be by revolution or insurrection. So amendment is essentially the anti-insurrection mechanism within the Constitution. It is the way to peacefully change the government, some fundamental aspect of the government. They didn't really provide for the Supreme Court overruling acts of Congress or turning back longstanding interpretations of the Constitution or offering wholly new interpretations of the Constitution. But that is that practice was established fairly early on. It is a longstanding practice. There are a lot of people who are very angry about it, but they tend to be angry about it only when they don't like the people who are on the court. They're not angry about it in principle. They're angry about the results of judicial activism. So at the moment, because we have a conservative court, liberals are angry about judicial activism. But across history, when the court is liberal, which was the case, from the middle of the 1950s until the 1970s, conservatives were angry about judicial activism and were very interested in amendment. There's not a lot of people whose long careers as activists or politicians or legal scholars really survives the switch in ideological affinity of the court.
Well, you mentioned Article 5 before. Do you still see this as, you call it a sleeping giant, which is, I believe, what Napoleon called China at one time. And you say it changes when there's war, and then we went for well after a couple of 100 years without any amendments. I'm wondering how you see Article 5 as a sleeping giant and why.
Because it turns out that amendments over the course of American history have generally come, it's not exactly the rule of three, but in little flurries. That Washington called amendment a constitutional door to be left open to the people. And the door is generally closed. And it's often locked. And there is really no way structurally to amend the Constitution, or there's not a lot of political will to do so, or there are not problems that people think could be addressed by constitutional amendment. But once an amendment gets through, once someone opens the door, there tends to be, a bit of a rush of people trying to get through the door all at once. So you think about the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments come all at once. Then essentially the Constitution, the amendment provision goes back to sleep. The 3 Civil War and Reconstruction amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments come all in a rush. 16, 17, 18, 19, 20 come all in a rush between 1913 and 1920. There are 4 amendments ratified between 1961 and 1971. But in between these little flurries of activity, there's not just a lot of no amendments getting ratified. There really isn't a lot of amendment proposals being discussed. So it's not entirely clear what triggers, what force actually finally pushes open the door. But some part of it is frustration with the Supreme Court, right? So the Civil War amendments are only made possible because there's a war, but the war is a consequence of the Supreme Court's decision in Dred Scott in 1857.
And would you say, as I think you intimate in your book, that maybe the most consequential amendment, if you separate the Bill of Rights and those first 10 amendments, is the 14th Amendment in terms of its effect and impact?
Yeah, there are plenty of historians who, Eric Foner talks about the 14th Amendment and the 13th and 15th together with it as a second founding. There were a lot of Americans who in the 1860s and 70s thought that Americans would stop celebrating the 4th of July and would instead celebrate the date of the ratification of the 14th Amendment, because those 3 amendments taken together really transform the Constitution and extend its securities and privileges and immunities to people who had been left out in the way the court at least interpreted the original Constitution.
Particularly the 14th, I think of, 3/5 of a man as far as Black people, but women were not even involved in any of these details in terms of the amendments, or certainly until the 19th Amendment, when they were given the franchise to vote, were sort of absent. And what I'm struck by in your book, I think of a line from Adrienne Rich, a poem of hers, which is called Diving into the Wreck, where she talks about the books in which our names did not appear. You've taken a lot of names that have not appeared in the history books or appeared only tangentially and are obscure, essentially, especially where women are concerned, but also where Blacks are concerned and where Indigenous people are concerned. And you said, what you really have said is these are an important part of this American history. They need to understand the contributions they made, what they had to offer, what they did, what impact they had, and so forth. And it's very detailed, and it's frankly wonderful to read, because it's a different kind of history almost in some way, almost a revisionism of history from that originalism.
It's I love that you mentioned Adrienne Rich. I read that poem maybe freshman year of college. It really affected me. I spent a lot of time reading her papers here at Harvard at the Schlesinger Library. Those that are open, most of her papers are still restricted. I'm fascinated by Rich. I really wanted to offer up. I really don't think we can have really a democratic future until we have a more democratic past. That is to say, the revolution in American history and research and writing that began in the 1960s and 70s with generations of a new generation of Black historians, Chicano historians, Asian American historians, women historians, people who came from the gay rights movement, disability scholars, really has exploded the story that we tell about American history and makes it legible, that the conflicts that we have inherited and the comedy that we have inherited as a nation and as a people. And we're living in a moment where the very tremendous contributions of that era of historical research, especially archival research, is very much under threat, where there are states in this union where, talking about racial conflict over the course of American history, or ethnic difference and how it affected voting patterns and, elections of decades ago, these things are no longer sayable in certain classrooms.
Well, let's be blunt about this. We have a president who wants to essentially change what's in the Smithsonian and maybe the whole way that American history is presented. And by the way, it should be added here that, as you point out in your book, Alexander Hamilton, no less, wanted the president to serve for life. So our present president would be in agreement with Hamilton, I guess, probably, wouldn't he?
I mean, again, like where I think that I would absolutely cede that there are plenty of people who can defend originalism as a mode of judicial interpretation. I would argue with them, but I think there's a defense to say, like, these are the important documents. These are the ones we need to read because these are the ones that carry the meaning that is relevant to the law. You cannot defend that as a historian. You cannot say, oh, the only history and this is where I think the bleed comes, right? From originalism to the larger culture. Oh, the only history that can be taught, the only history that we need to know, the only history that we need to read, that our children need to know, is essentially the sort of fictive ancestry that is originalism, that we really only need to know about these people, but not those people. I really was struck in reading, Robert Bork was once asked, just how constrained is your available historical record for understanding the Constitution? And someone said, if a scholar found a letter written by George Washington to Martha Washington explaining what he meant by direct taxes, would that be available to you to understand the meaning of direct taxes? And he said, no, like absolutely not. That's irrelevant to our understanding of this phrase, even if, Washington, who presided over the Constitutional Convention, had written it. And what I think Bork could not fathom is the possibility that Martha Washington or people held on Mount Vernon as slaves, or people in nearby towns in Virginia who were poor farmers, tobacco farmers, or indentured servants of other tobacco farmers, that the ideas of anyone else about taxation could possibly matter to our understanding of the Constitution. Again, like you can say as an originalist, as a judge, I don't care about that. As a historian, you can't say that. As a teacher of history, you can't say that. All of those ways that Americans have believed, fought over, contested, agitated for interpretations of the Constitution are a part of our constitutional past.
Well, one thing that's not a part of it is God and Christianity. And we've had a separation of church and state. And there are many who would say, oh, there was a Christian amendment movement that you write about, for example. And many would say now, this is something that maybe should be done. It's time that it came to pass. We have the death of Charlie Kirk, who's a martyr to Christian nationalism, a lot of certainly fervor around that issue and so forth. Address for us, if you could, shall you say, the possible ambiguity of church and state or Christianity being separate from our Constitution.
Yeah, I think that's a tricky one for constitutional conservatives because the 18th century record isn't a special help. There were attempts even from the get-go. Benjamin Rush, I think it is, famously wrote to John Adams upon reading the Constitution. He said, you guys did a great job down there in Philadelphia, but like you forgot one thing. You forgot to mention God. And I hope you're going to fix that soon. Like that could be amended pretty easily. And they didn't forget. Right? They offered up a different document, and they also ratified as the first of the amendments that were proposed, our First Amendment, establishing freedom of religion, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom to petition. These were the fundamental freedoms that those Americans who did not love the Constitution wanted to be sure were added to it, first of all. That is a really meaningful history, and it's not that there hasn't been a lot of contestation over the absence of the language of a Christian God in particular in the Constitution, because it's kind of been an evergreen. When the Civil War broke out, the Confederate Constitution, I believe, does mention God, and
it definitely does.
some Union ministers said, we're losing this war because our Constitution doesn't have God in it. Yeah. And we better fix that right away so we can win the war because we've offended God. And so that's the first sort of real movement, not just kind of occasional thoughts and concerns, but there is a genuine movement for a God amendment to the Constitution. But it is almost immediately answered by a movement to counter that movement by adding a more enhanced religious freedom amendment to the Constitution that is led by a number of people, including a rabbi in the Midwest who, cherishes America's record of freedom of religion and the non-establishment of religion, this, what you refer to as a separation of church and state. And these two forces do battle for decades in the decades after the Civil War. There's a kind of hilarious, I think it's a newspaper story in the 1890s where some guy's reporting what it's like in the lobby outside the halls of Congress. And he's like, you have on the one side all these people that want to put God in the Constitution, and then you have all these other people who want to make sure those other people don't put God in the Constitution, and they're sort of locked in a battle forever, and no one listening to either of them. Like, the status quo ante is kind of what Congress is fine with, like that. But that, it has been an ongoing struggle in American public life that there have been from the start Christians who believe the Constitution does not sufficiently recognize Christianity. And there have been from the start Americans who were opposed to taking further
going back to the
steps
beginning.
So. Yeah.
And you mentioned cartoons. You've got a lot of cartoons here going back to the beginning. I mean, this was a whole research project in itself, I imagine, wasn't it?
Oh, the visual stuff?
Yeah.
The Library of Congress has this incredible collection of political cartoons. There was just far more than one could possibly use. You could really tell the story of Americans' arguments over the Constitution through political cartoons.
And I'm also wondering, every time there's a presidential election, you hear one person, one vote. That's the way it should be. That may be, in fact, even what some people who know the intentions of the founding fathers had in mind. And yet the Electoral College exists, and there's a whole history in your book that goes into why it exists and continues to exist, having to do with slavery. And yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know what happened there. We just went blank for a minute. Maybe because we're talking about the Electoral College, somebody undermined us. We live in a paranoid age, but I know we've got to get you out of here and get you to class on time, and I have every intention of doing that. But people who have questions, please post them. But my last question was about the Electoral College and why, we've seen these polls that show that maybe it's time to retire the Electoral College, and yet it seems impossible because of the amendments being impossible.
Yeah, I think that, it is among the most frequently proposed amendment to the Constitution, but it's a little bit like, people like the Supreme Court having a lot of power when they like who's on the Supreme Court, and then when they don't like who's on the Supreme Court, suddenly they start arguing against the power of the Supreme Court. People like the Electoral College when it seems to favor their candidates and their party, and they don't like it otherwise, which makes it very difficult to amend. A proposal that I have heard that I think is quite interesting. Have you ever heard of a Sunrise Amendment?
No.
A Sunrise Amendment is an amendment that is set to go into effect sometime in the future. So let's say we were able to consider a constitutional amendment to replace the Electoral College with some other mechanism of amending the president. Maybe it's a national popular vote. Maybe it's something in between an Electoral College and a national popular vote. But that it wouldn't go into effect until 2060. I'm trying to figure out what the next an election year far in the distant future, far enough in the future that there's no reason to believe that the new method of electing the president would favor one party or the other, or at least you couldn't anticipate which party it would favor, to allow for the possibility of amendment while removing the immediate disincentive to consider a possible change.
What kind of a movement is it in terms of its traction? Or
I don't think it's a movement. That's just an idea. You hear people are like, well, if there are some people that really think it's important to revive the practice of amending the Constitution. And those people puzzle over, well, how could we get people to even be willing to think about amending the Constitution? One of the things a large percentage of Americans have often wanted to do, although their views change again with the nature of political power, is abolish the electoral college. Well, okay, that might be a place to begin, but it's a really hard sell unless what would be a way to get people to be willing to consider that? Well, if it weren't to take to effect, if it weren't to go into effect for many decades. So it's not a movement. It's a hypothetical.
I wanted to ask you about some of what you bring light to, which for a historian can create perhaps even a little bit of a crisis of conscience. You write with extreme light on the lives and contributions of people like Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony, um, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, but you're also not reluctant to point out some of the, shall we say, not so appealing sides, not only the schisms that existed between blacks and women, for example, or feeling towards the suffragette movement by many blacks, or the feeling about blacks being given more concessions from women who were more, shall we say, radicalized at the time. But in other words, there's a lot of division that you take up. I was kind of appalled to find out Elizabeth Cady Stanton referred to black people as Sambo, for example. I mean, it just hit me in a very strong way. And yet this is all a part of telling the American story, isn't it?
Yeah, I think I'm not lobbying for these people to be put up on pedestals. I'm actually just trying to offer up a fuller history. So people say beautiful things and they say horrible things. But the historian's job, I wrote this in a preface to a book I wrote some years ago, is really to just collect all of those things, the pretty flowers and the ugly bugs, and press them between the pages.
Well, there's a lot compressed in your pages. I mean, I learned more about Sally Hemings than I knew before. I learned more about Victoria Woodhull, and by the way, she was actually. People always say Shirley Chisholm was the first woman to run for president, but Victoria Woodhull ran for president. Not that she was enfranchised or had the possibility of ever being nominated, but this is a historical fact that many are just not aware of.
Yeah, she's a fun character too.
Yeah, she is a fun character. I mean, you learn about some of the things that she was involved in that are just amazing. Free love and secession, and so it goes. And you capture the lives of these people. And I'm just wondering, as a historian, how important is that to get the multidimensional sense of what we in the literary trade would call the full dimensional character, what E.M. Forster said, the round character, as opposed to the flat character.
Yeah, I mean, I like to. I mean, really, this book, which is kind of a companion to my book, These Truths from 2018, is really meant to people the story of American history, and in this case, the story of American constitutional history, to really populate the pages of these accounts of very complicated politics and legal ideas and uh, political disputes, to tell the story of these, I often like somewhat abstruse ideas and arguments about ideas, to embody those ideas through the stories of individual people and their ordinary lives. That's just a method that I use. I think that readers like getting to the bottom of a story maybe more than they enjoy getting to the end of an argument. So my narrative method as a historian, because I always do have an argument, is to braid together the story and the argument. And I think people remember very complicated ideas better when they can remember those ideas through the experience of a particular character. So I write about Patsy Takemoto Mink, who was a U.S. Congresswoman from Hawaii, who is credited as the author of Title IX. She did a lot of other things. She had a lot of constitutional views that help us understand that era through, I think, a little bit outside the frame of how we maybe ordinarily tell that era. I tell much the same era in These Truths, largely through Phyllis Schlafly, the conservative kind of battle general of the modern conservative movement throughout the second half of the 20th century. So I just think that people remember the ideas better if they have a character to attach them to.
Yeah, it's good history and it's good storytelling. I'm reminded of an interview I did many years ago with Gore Vidal, who said, and you may want to talk about this also as an educator, he couldn't understand why students didn't find history fascinating, because it's so fascinating to read and the stories are so embedded in it. And stories are fascinating, tales that are told and people's lives and so forth that come into focus. We need to do more on that score. I mean, not only in terms of civics, but making students more excited by history. I'm not sure what the key to that is. Some thoughts from you as an educator?
Um, I don't know. I think K to 12 teachers do an incredible job getting students interested in all the things that they have the obligation to get them interested in. I also think they are in our society the most important people at holding together civil society, because K to 12 classrooms are really just about the only place in the country left where we're expected to get together and politely disagree with one another and listen to one another and learn from one another. I think the rules of classroom etiquette are hard fought and difficult to implement. And I think we ask of kids much more than we ask of one another in terms of gathering together with people who are different than we are, who have different views, who might express their views differently, and finding a way forward. So I guess I wouldn't task hardworking teachers with coming up with a more sophisticated way or a wholly new way of teaching history. I think they do it exceptionally well.
That's generous of you, and there are many wonderful teachers. I quite agree with you. It's getting kids interested, though, and getting them inspired that is a real challenge, and civic-minded. We got some questions from the audience that I'd like to go to. The first one wants to know, was the U.S. Constitution created with the idea of a two-party system in mind, and do you think that it could withstand the idea of a multi-party system?
No, there were not political parties in 1787. The two-party system begins to emerge in the 1790s. Historians generally date the birth of the modern two-party system to the election of 1800. Some people would say 1796. So one of the things that's tricky about supermajority requirements that are in the Constitution, like the two-thirds majority required, say, for impeachment, or the two-thirds supermajority of both houses required for amendment, those looked like reasonable bars. You want it to be hard to do those things, to impeach someone, to amend the Constitution, or send an amendment to the states. But you don't want it to be impossible. But the thing is, once you have parties, the math doesn't work out so well anymore. So it is a feature of the kind of somewhat poor fit between our Constitution and our party system that accounts for some of the dysfunction of the Constitution across different moments of American history, including our own.
Another question from one of our listeners, viewers. Do you think an anti-gerrymandering amendment that took the right to redistrict that after each census away from the states and made redistricting automatic based on a computer program, for example, would be passable and might move Congress back toward the middle?
I don't know. I think that, yeah, that's a great question. There are a lot of different creative ideas around how to navigate through the gerrymandering impasse. I haven't given it enough study to have an informed opinion about what I think is the best idea.
I think we were cut off when you were talking about solutions. And since solutions are here again, can you talk a bit more about the amendment process and how it can be fixed?
I don't know that it can be fixed. I'm really not a policymaker. I don't have a prescription in this book. I don't offer one. On the whole, I think we might be better off if the Constitution were slightly easier to amend, but not much easier. And that's beyond the realm of the currently possible. And I don't plot out political campaigns or constitutional campaigns, not what I do. I think that, one of the reasons I wrote the book was to consider what it means that we have abandoned these practices, not just the practice of amending the Constitution, but the practice of holding state constitutional conventions, which used to be quite routinely held. The last one, though, the last full constitutional convention in the states was held in Rhode Island in 1986. And I'm also
forgive me, as you point out, blacks had national conventions, women had national conventions, and these were very important.
Conventions are really kind of like jury duty, a really important way for people to exercise their rights as citizens, to be a part of self-government to act in the drafting and revising of constitutions. They're not all great. There have been some catastrophic things done at constitutional conventions. I don't mean to suggest that they're great, but I do think the fact that we no longer gather to deliberate over fundamental law, the fact that we have stopped amending the federal constitution, these are forms of atrophy of our constitutional order that we should take note of and ask ourselves, what's lost when we no longer do these things? And a lot of people say on the left, oh my God, we shouldn't have a convention. We shouldn't open up the discussion of amendments because we'll just get like a MAGA constitution. But I guess my answer to that is I think we essentially have a MAGA constitution. I mean, we await the decisions of the Supreme Court on some of the executive overreach of the current administration. But I think you can say that would be bad, but my answer is bad compared to what? And I don't offer a prescription. I don't offer a solution. I wanted to offer up a history that would allow people to have take a fresh look at American constitutional history.
But historians, especially eminent historians like yourself, are often asked not necessarily to prognosticate or make policy or support or go after policy, but are often asked, judging by history, past this prologue, what can we hope? What can we see in a sanguine way about the Constitution itself and its endurance?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of Americans who would say the Constitution is responsible for the durability of the nation, that it forms our national creed, that it tells our national story, and that it is responsible for our prosperity. You could equally find other Americans that would say, and have said over the course of American history, this Constitution was flawed from the start. What's valuable about the Constitution is all the attempts to amend it, and especially the important Civil War and Reconstruction amendments and the progressive amendments, and how they made it possible for the Constitution to continue without essentially collapsing. And that debate itself has been fairly continuous across American history. I often think of the moment in 1987 that was the bicentennial of the Constitution. It was a time when there were parades all over the country. Philadelphia had a big We the People parade. Disney had a big We the People parade to celebrate the 200th anniversary of the drafting of the Constitution. And meanwhile, Robert Bork was on television defending originalism as he was being questioned by the Senate Judiciary Committee regarding his nomination to the Supreme Court. And at the time, as Bork and others on the Supreme Court were beginning to elaborate the philosophy of originalism, Thurgood Marshall, who was the first African-American to serve as a Supreme Court justice, he had also argued Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, the decision that ended segregation in schools. Marshall was asked, will you accept an invitation to honor the 200th anniversary of the Constitution? And he said, no. He said, I will not. What I will honor instead are the 200 years of struggle to realize the promise of the Constitution. And that's where I lean. And that's also a position that's more consistent with being interested in the course of history and the course of human events, rather than in viewing a document as a kind of scripture.
Could you say something about the whole argument that still persists over nullification? How you see it?
Over like Calhoun-style nullification?
Yeah.
I do think that really persists, Michael. I think that's just a far-fetched. I don't think that's a live.
Some of the extremists
question.
keep coming back to it, over and over again.
And there's also a secession movement in Texas, but I don't think there's a lot of purchase for these.
Well, what about shadow docket? How does that fit into all this? And I mean by that, the emergency Supreme Court docket in which the court makes decisions without arguments or briefs in terms of constitutionality?
Yeah, I don't talk about shadow docket in the book. There's, Steve Vladeck has done incredible work and continues to do great work on that subject. I think listeners, viewers have lots of places to go for that. One of the things that I've tried to do here in the way I tell the story of the Constitution is pay a little bit less attention to the Supreme Court, since the history of the Constitution, which is generally written from law schools and by law professors, is a series of Supreme Court decisions analyzed in relationship to one another. The Supreme Court has always been and remains extremely important to the U.S. Constitution and its evolution. But I am not a Supreme Court historian, and I'm a political historian. So I'm not the person to ask, what do we need to know about the shadow docket? Because I think
Well, you're
we
also
need
a
to
person
pull our
who's-
attention a little bit away from the court itself.
You're very much a historian about American history, though we only have a couple minutes left. I want to know, since you write about Native Americans and how they interacted with the Constitution and with their own tribal constitutions, what should people take away from that history?
Yeah, this is a hugely important and truly fascinating part of and adjacent to American constitutional history. Native nations have long traditions of unwritten constitutions going back centuries and centuries. The first written constitution for a Native nation is the Cherokee Constitution of 1827. But constitution writing among Native nations has gone through many periods of change. The really important era in the 1930s, when the federal government really wanted Native nations to write their own constitutions. And at the moment, constitution writing conventions, amendments are incredibly vital among Native Americans. There are constitutional conventions going on with fair frequency and a lot of innovation constitutionally among Native nations these days. So the very practices of convening, people being involved in drafting and revising fundamental law that are really dormant in the United States, both at the level of the states and at the level of the federal government, are incredibly active among Native nations. So it's a very important tradition to trace and to pay attention to. And it's very important to think about the kind of reciprocity of influence between Native nations and Native constitutionalism and constitutionalism in the United States.
And I should say, by the end of the book, you bring in Vin Deloria, along with other names from that more contemporary period, including Birch Bayh. I hadn't realized what a major contribution he was working toward, and also Patsy Mink and Phyllis Schlafly, names that I wish we had more time to talk more about, but I want to make sure you get to class in time. And this was what we call a hard out, but also a great delight talking to Jill Lepore. Her new book is called We the People, A History of the U.S. Constitution. And for more information about membership or upcoming in-person and virtual Commonwealth Club programs, please visit commonwealthclub.org. Thank you again, Jill Lepore.
Thanks so much, Michael.
I'm Michael Krasny. Thank you all for joining us.